One of the ways that you can remember a lot of information is to place them in categories. And by doing that, it helps you to remember a list of things pertaining to one area. So for composers, I have my students to list them into basketball teams. Basketball teams, the reason I selected that is because usually it represents five players, five excellent players, and people like LeBron James or Michael Jordan or Steph Curry. Those are well-known names, especially Steph Curry right now and LeBron James. They're well-known in basketball around the world, and Michael Jordan had his time. So by placing them in basketball teams, then the students are able to remember them a lot faster. And so each student has to come up with at least a name for the team and then those five composers that they think represents that period very well. So here I have my basketball teams for each historical period. That allows me to remember it, because sometimes it might be just visual for me to help me to remember who's on the Renaissance team. And then I can see the list almost in my brain because I've studied the list. So let's look at my list. So this is just a quick example of how I have my students to remember the composers during each period. So here I have the Renaissance Rough Riders. And I don't know, I just pick Rough Riders because I like to say Rough Riders. So, if I say little things like that, it helps me to remember some things. So the Renaissance period, as we can see, represents 1430 to 1600, give or take. The history books, different history books give slightly different dates, but overall, 1400s to 1600. So who's on my starting lineup? So of course we got Josh Quinn de Prez, John Dowland, Palestrina, Monteverdi, and Bird. So what the students are going to do is they're going to find representative pieces from each one of these composers. And on their team, when they have, Josh Quinn de Prez is coming in, they have to play an excerpt of some of his music, because we have to hear what he's capable of doing. And so that little excerpt of music allows us to hear that particular type of music. Now, I have him as number one, so that's like my LeBron James. These are all important, of course, in music history. And the most important thing is that you at least know the sounds and what type of music they created during their time period. So you want to make sure that you are finding representative pieces. They're probably all right in your history books, your music history books. But if they're not, they're in other music history books, or they're definitely online. And they will always talk about those pieces that are more well-known than others. All right? The next team is the Baroque Barracudas. I don't know where I get these names from. They just pop up in my head. So the Baroque period, as we know, starting to have more composers, of course. But the man for the Baroque Barracudas is definitely Bach. You have studied so much Bach in your courses of music, especially music history of the Baroque period. As far as harmony, you were doing 4-part harmony like Baroque, Bach was doing. So he is the most well-known. He is the Michael Jordan of this time period. Now, he had a contemporary Handel, which his musical works were just as important, but you always hear Bach's name first before you hear of Handel. So on the exam, if they were to pick somebody from the Baroque period, it's probably going to be between Bach and Handel. But they could, of course, because you have studied a number of people from the Baroque period, it could be anybody's name. Vivaldi is well known for string music, so they could pick somebody like Vivaldi. We don't know who they're going to pick. But what we do need to know is who are the most recognized composers from the Baroque period. And these are the most recognized composers as far as my study of history. I know it's probably going to be one of these names. Now, there are a lot of composers during this period. And so your favorite composer may not be on this list. It doesn't mean that they're not important. It just means I'm trying to select the top 5 or top 6 composers for each period. And their dates, the Baroque period, of course, is the 1600 to 1750. So let's pay attention to 1750. That date is probably in every music history book to end the Baroque period. And do you know why it is ending at 1750? It's because Bach died in 1750. So he is so important in the Baroque period that they stopped the timeline at the end of his life. Now, we know they were still making Baroque music after 1750. However, as far as historians are concerned, they selected that particular date or that year as the end date of the Baroque period as far as we're studying. So just keep that in mind. 1750 is Bach's death. That's why it is represented as 1750. So we have Bach, Handel, Corelli, Vivaldi, and Rameau. For my classical kings, we are, the historical period is from 1750 to 1820, not very long. And our major players or our major composers during this time period are, of course, Amadeus Mozart. He is well known. I mean, Mozart, when you think of classical music, you think of him. And so also Haydn. Haydn is considered the father of the modern symphony. So he wrote quite a few symphonies. You probably know, was that Symphony number 101, which is Surprise. I'm sure you've heard that before. And he's also known for writing a lot of string quartets. He's kind of the father of the string quartet as well. We have Beethoven, of course. We have studied quite a bit of his work. Beethoven is important because he's in both periods. He's in the classical period and he moves into the romantic period. So his earlier works are represented in the classical period, whereas his later works are in the romantic. You have Franz Schubert, and then you have Clementi. So these are the 5 for my actual classical kings. You want to make sure that you find representative pieces, at least 1 or 2, that you're listening to in order to prepare for the exam. Our romantic victors, starting lineup for me. Well, first of all, let's look at the years. We have 1820 to 1900. And the romantic period, as we know, we started to have way more development in form. We have more developing instruments. The music has more chromaticism. There's a lot that's going on in the romantic period and across the board as far as Western music. And what we know, everybody's not isolated or they're not centralized in one place. It's all throughout Europe area. And so, and you want to know that because say that they ask, give you a list of all German composers, or the main German composers, or the 5, meaning if you know what the 5 is, that means it's the 5 Russian composers. So who are they? So things like that, you want to be familiar with those type of terms. So here, of course, Beethoven, as I said in the last slide, he is represented in his later works as well. So he's in the romantic period. Then you have Brahms and Wagner, Chopin, which focus a lot on the piano, Schumann, Verdi, and then Robert Schumann. So this is just a small list of composers who are well known from the romantic period. This list is long. The romantic period has one of the longest lists of composers because people are composing music all around. And a lot of their works are well known, especially in music history classes. They're well known in just the music in general. So these people, a lot of these people, you really want to know their works. Like I said before in a video of a drop the needle type of thing. Drop the needle in a romantic period, you really have to know what compositional techniques these composers like to use in order to be able to identify it. Because you not only have to identify the period, which is the romantic period, the possible composer that actually composed the piece. Around what year was it? Like, okay, is it 1830s or 1840s or 1850s? Yes, it was just like that. It was very specific. They tried to narrow it down as much as possible based on the sounds that were being created. It's just like now. There are sounds that are being created right now that did not exist 5 years ago. and there be sounds being created in, say, Atlanta, that are not being created in New York. So it's region, and it's also the type of the sounds that they're using or the techniques that they're using. So even in this today's music, there are some sounds that are very identifiable to certain composers. Like for instance, Prince. I only have to hear one measure of the music, and I can tell that sounds like Prince music. Just by the way he uses harmonies, the way he uses rhythms and things of that sort, I'm usually able to say that sounds like a Prince song. And we know Prince wrote all his own music, and he was the composer and everything else like that. So these are the type of people that you want to study them. They're well known. You want to know who they are, and you want to make sure that they are on your playlist, because you want to keep track of each artist and each composer. All right, so we have our basketball team of the Impressionists. Their dates are 1860 to 1882. Now, I only have two starters on this team because they are the two most representative composers from that time period. So we of course have Debussy, Claude Debussy. Oh, his work is just absolutely beautiful. Well, their works are beautiful, but I really love his works. And then Ravel, Maurice Ravel. So if they have their name on the exam, you know they are considered impressionist composers. So if they're playing something like Prelude to Afternoon of the Faun, it's an impressionist period piece, and so they may have impressionists, they may have Baroque, Renaissance, and classical. And so if you know what music sounds like from the impressionist period, then you'll be able to identify it very quickly. So you want to make sure that you are finding one or two of their pieces that they're well known for, and then listening to them a few times in order to get the sound in your ear. And then our last group is the 20th Century Comets. They're from 1900s to 1950. I gave them the name Comets because sometimes especially when I was younger and had to listen to a lot of their music, it sounds like it's out of space. It's just like, it's different. Especially people like Schoenberg and Berg. Yeah, their music, it's a lot of atonal type of sounds in it, so it's kind of out of space. So that's why I picked Comets. They're not all of them. Even Bartok, that serialism and atonal type of sound, it just seems like it's out there. So if they're going to be playing music that sounds atonal, we're talking about the serialism and things of that sort. They come from the 20th century. I mean, they have a lot of disjunct motion in the melodic structure. A lot of their harmonies it just has a very interesting sound. I'll say that much. I'm sure you're very familiar with what I'm saying. But some of the representatives from the 20th century, early 20th century, of course, and we're still talking about art music, Western music, is Bartok, Stravinsky, Aaron Copland, Schoenberg, Cage, and then Berg. And Aaron Copland, I love Aaron Copland music. He has a piece that's called Rodeo. I mean, he has some kind of Western type of sounds, themes that were in his music. So I love some of his work. Even Stravinsky. I mean, all of them. I've listened to all of them because as a music person, you want to be exposed to as many different sounds as possible. So when I do hear music that sounds a lot more chromaticism and no tonal center and things of that sort, my mind automatically goes to 20th century. So when they present a listening portion on the exam that has music that sounds like it's atonal, or music that sounds like it has a lot of rhythmic activity going on, harmonic activity, because you have to remember, we're talking about moving from the Renaissance, or really before the Renaissance, because we're talking about antiquity and medieval period and all of that. But if you think about way back in the beginning of time when we actually started creating music or recording it in some way, writing it down or whatever, it was very simple compared to what it is now. They did not have all the instruments available to them. They did not have all the different rhythms we use now. They didn't have all the different harmonies we use now. It's over time, music, of course, developed. It evolved into what it is now. So what you want to know is, okay, so during which periods did certain type of things happen? During this period, the music sounded like this, meaning everybody in that time period was writing music that had this quality of sound, or using these particular textures, or using these particular instruments, or whatever else like that. So it helps you to understand what period it's from based on the melodic material, or the harmonic material, or even the form. A lot of that information is based on your understanding of what was happening during that time period. So for instance, like the piano. If you hear a piano piece, well, you know it's not from the medieval period. Why? Because the piano didn't exist during that time. So if you know that, and they give the medieval period as an example of one of the answers, well, you can just automatically cross that off, because there is no piano in the medieval period. So it's based on your ears, your understanding of sounds, your understanding of historical periods, and then your understanding of who used what type of compositional techniques. If you have a good understanding of that, you will do well on the exam as far as music history is concerned. If you do not have a good understanding of it, then that's when you want to do extra study work. You want to talk to your music history professor. Like, you know what, I really need to, I don't really get his music. Is there something about the characteristic sound of his music that makes him stand out? Your music history professor would love to talk to you about compositions and composers and the time period. They would love to do that, just like I would love to talk about music ed things to my students. This is what we have studied. So I'm encouraging you to create these teams. It can be a baseball team, it can be whatever. It's just a way for you to outline and categorize these names to help you to remember, well, what period does this person come from? Because you don't want to put Stravinsky, and Stravinsky name sound familiar. I think he's from the classical period. Nope, he's not. And so you want to make sure that you make these lists and you know all the players that's on the list. So if they present their names at any point on the list or on the exam, you can clearly see, okay, yes, Stravinsky was in the 20th century. And that's how you can answer the question if they're asking about a 20th century composer. So I want to encourage you to make your list and study your list, share your list with your group, and talk about and listen to these composers' music and talk about some of the characteristic sounds that you're hearing in it. That way, when you are presented with that type of information on the exam, you will feel very confident and be familiar with the sounds that are represented from each historical period.